what can I say, dynamic logo, dynamic organization. You know, that's right, here we are. My name is Richard Volstek. I'm president of the American Chamber of Commerce here in Hong Kong. And on behalf of the Board of Governors of the American Chamber here in Hong Kong, a hearty welcome to you all. This is our annual China Conference, and we are delighted to have a first-rate line of speakers and panelists to talk about the new normal in China. Those of you who may see we're all color-coded in this room. Just for your information, it's not random. The red tags are members of our board of governors of the chamber or past members of the board. Yellow members are committee chairs. Yellow cards are committee chairs. So you have questions about how the chamber operates and so forth, please talk to them or people with blue tags who are members. If you have a gray tag, we have special services for you today. It means you're not yet a member, and we have a membership booth out by the staircase near the elevators. During the course of the conference, during the coffee hour, whatever, we have some special benefits for registering today if you're not a member, and a staff there ready to take care of you. So I encourage you to be involved in the chamber, and you'll see from the contents of our conference today, I think, why it's a good thing to do. Now, may I ask you, now that I have your attention fully, please put your phones, other devices on silent. No, keyboard clicking or buzzing or so forth, so we will not disturb the speakers today. Thank you very much. As you all know, the China Conference for the Chamber is a very big deal indeed, and it would not be possible without our generous sponsors and support from many companies in the Chamber and other friends in the community. Very happy to say and give a hearty thank you to our gold sponsors, General Electric, KPMG, and Thomson Reuters. Our silver sponsors, Sino Singapore, Guangzhou, Knowledge City, and TMF Hong Kong Limited. Our bronze sponsors, CUHK Business School, Chinese University of Hong Kong, JLL, Scholastic Asia, United Technologies Building Industrial Systems. Our airline partner for this conference is United Airlines. Our broadcast partner is CNBC. And we have a number of good media sponsors as well, Caixin Media Company Limited, China Daily, Desin Shira and Associates, PR Newswire Asia. And our supporting organizations this year are our sister chambers in China, AmChamHK in Beijing, AmChamHK, and AmCham South China, as well as the SIFMA, the Asia Securities Industries and Financial Markets Association, CFA Institute, Hong Kong Investment Funds Association, Hong Kong Trade Development Council, and Invest Hong Kong. We take our supporting sponsors and organizations very, very seriously. The fact they're on the board in front of you doesn't just suggest that they just support this China Conference. We have great dealings with them throughout the year, and a hearty thanks to you all for your support. It is now my very great pleasure to really get things underway this morning by introducing this year and last year's chairman, Peter Levesque from Modern Terminals.
Thank you, Richard, and good morning, everyone. On behalf of the American Chamber in Hong Kong, welcome to this year's China Conference, and a special welcome to U.S. Consul General Ford Hart, who just squeaked it in, and to all our distinguished guests here today that have been such big supporters of the Chamber over the years. Slowing growth in China, Beijing intervention, global market turmoil, devaluation of the renminbi, a renewed vigor around China's anti-corruption campaign, massive explosions in Tianjin. You could look at these events and say that it's been a very difficult year, or you could just look at these events and call it August. For sure, conventional wisdom around what we thought was normal in China has been significantly altered over the past couple of months, and the timing of this year's China Conference couldn't be better. As we take this time this morning to discuss China's new normal, I can't imagine a more experienced group of speakers than the business leaders that we have gathered with us here today. So on behalf of AmCham and AmCham's Board of Governors, welcome to the 2015 China Conference, Managing in the New Normal, and thank you all for your continued support of the Chamber here in Hong Kong. It's my pleasure now to bring Mr. Sanjeev Chatrath, MD of Thomson Reuters, to the stage to introduce our keynote speaker this morning. Thank you all. Enjoy the conference. Sanjeev, over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Good morning, everyone. Most of you will agree that the pace and the scale of economic growth that China has witnessed over the last few decades has really been unprecedented. There are not too many countries around in the world who've grown the way that China has grown over the last few decades, with the scale that China already had, growing 15 folds just over 2 decades. We are today at the crossroads of perhaps one of the most significant transformational changes with regards to the Chinese economy, when nations, financial institutions, and corporations are keenly watching what's the implication of that to their businesses all over the world. When we think about the change that China is undertaking right now, it has far-reaching implications, and some of the events over the last few months, as Peter just pointed out, are good testimony of that. So first of all, I wanted to thank AmCham for putting together this event. We are excited about the great agenda that's ahead of us today. It's great to see a number of very distinguished guests and speakers. I also wanted to thank AmCham for your continued support for the business community and the advocacy for the business in this region. As the most trusted source of news and intelligent information, Thomson Reuters is proud to be a sponsor, along with all the other speakers and sponsors over here. We've had a very strong and sustained presence on the mainland for more than 140 years, during which time we continue to support both the internationalization of the Chinese economy and also helping a number of our clients trying to navigate the new normal by providing insights and trusted information. So I'm looking forward to the discussions today, and I wish all the speakers all the very best. It is now my pleasure to introduce the first keynote speaker, Christopher Johnson. So Chris is an authority when it comes to China affairs. He's been very actively involved with the China affairs for more than 2 decades and has been regularly consulting the White House and the government on a range of different topics, both from a foreign affairs point of view and intelligence. He's had past experience with the CIA, and he's presently a senior advisor for the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's based in Washington. Please join me in welcoming Chris to the stage. Chris.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you, Sanjeev, for that kind introduction. Let me also take the opportunity to thank Peter and Richard, especially for their kind invitation for me to come out here and address this conference. Obviously, whenever I come through Hong Kong, it's always good to touch base with the Chamber, have the opportunity to interact with members. One thing that's very exciting for me about it is, sitting in Washington, you often lose perspective on what's happening on the ground out here in Asia, and it's so helpful to be able to engage with you all who are in the China market every day, seeing it from all of its many angles and so on. And so that's very, very helpful, and just want to express my own and my institution, CSIS's strong support for the Chamber and anything we can do to be helpful for the Chamber. So I've been given the unenviable task of trying to frame the new normal for you all this morning. And I think we had someone made an interesting joke at our welcoming dinner last night, and they said that, by tomorrow morning, the new normal may have changed again. And I would argue that by the time I'm done speaking this morning, the new normal may have changed yet again. So what I'm going to try to do is step back a little bit and provide some framing thoughts about how to think about this new normal. One of the things I'd like to highlight is that in my own assessment, there really are several new normals. There's the new normal that Xi Jinping has described of slower growth and more balanced growth, but I think that sets off a whole range of various new normals, and we've seen this coming out of Xi Jinping. And you can define them as separate new normals or as aspects of the new normal that's been set out by Xi Jinping. So what are those things? Let me do three as some opening remarks, and then we'll have an opportunity to engage in Q&A. I think the first one, and we've seen this particularly on display here in the last week or two, is a new normal of intensifying leadership jockeying and maybe even infighting going on within the Chinese leadership. And I think we've seen several aspects or manifestations of this. Just to sort of as a frame of reference, my own sense is that given the very difficult things in the economy and politically that the leadership is trying to tackle, the atmosphere in my mind really much more resembles what we saw during the 1980s, which was sort of the last big time of wrenching change, if you will, inside the system. And saw some pretty heavy political infighting, obviously, at that time as vested interests of that era were being challenged and so on, and we see it again now. And my view is this will be the normal that we're going to see at least probably through 2020. And that means that we should expect to see some turbulence in the leadership, not just in terms of commentary that you see publicly and stories about various leaders being up or down, but also sort of this stuff spilling over into more of a public view, and I'll get into what I mean by that in a moment. Why are we seeing this sort of intensified jockeying? I think it's because Xi Jinping has done a lot since coming into power to sort of bend the Chinese system to his will, if you will. And I think it's been interesting to watch how quickly he's managed to consolidate power, to take a lot of the key bureaucracies. If you read 95% of the China watching community's viewpoint when Xi Jinping first came into power, I would say most of the commentary was, well, just like Hu Jintao, it's going to take him 2 to 3 years just to get settled into being the new leader. He's going to have not one, but two still living retired general secretaries overseeing him and so on, and this will put him in something of a box. I think there was a strong view that you have all these powerful institutions in the system that had been largely allowed to run wild, for lack of a better term, under Hu Jintao, those being the Chinese military, the PLA, the security services, state-owned enterprises, certainly elements of the party bureaucracy. So I think it's been pretty surprising to a lot of folks what Xi Jinping has done in all those spaces and the speed with which, as they would say in their lexicon, he has seized the commanding heights of that system. And how has he done this? Well, I think it's several tools. One, anti-corruption, of course, which was mentioned by Richard. We see this going on, whether it's netting high-level tigers, as they call them inside the system, or whether it's the flies at the lower level, a massive anti-corruption campaign. Lots of speculation several times since the campaign started that it was coming to an end. Quite clear it's not coming to an end. And in fact, if anything, my own sense is it's going to intensify again going forward, especially as we move toward the next party Congress in 2017. Secondly, an effort to create these new high-level leading groups and declare himself chairman of all of them. And you know, these have fundamentally changed in some ways how the leadership does business. I think the two that deserve the most attention are the one on, as they call it, comprehensively deepening reform, which obviously looks at the economy quite a bit, but not just that. It also takes on a series of other high-level important reform areas, whether it be reform to the judicial system, reform to China's hukou system or registration system, military reform. It's very comprehensive, and it came out of that third plenum that we saw in November of 2013. And I think the second one is the creation of this new National Security Commission on the sort of military and security services side. Very mysterious as to, you know, how operational that new body is. You see the leading group on comprehensively deepening reform meeting on a regular basis, making decisions, publicized accounts of what it's doing. Nothing like that on the side of the National Security Commission, and a lot of speculation about how much attention does it spend on domestic security issues and how much does it spend on managing foreign policy, and does it have the staffing and other things it needs to be able to function. But no doubt that he created something, got it done, that several of his predecessors had tried to do before him and had failed. And then thirdly, I think it is this issue of strengthening the role of the party and its involvement in the day-to-day management of just about everything, especially the economy. This is a real shift at the expense of the formal institutions of governance on the state council side. So not at all uncommon now to hear stories of state council ministries, and you all who are in business, you know, typically in the Hu Jintao era, what you could do is kind of pull down the chart of the wiring diagram of the Chinese system, the state council and the party, and that was something of a reflection of how power was flowing inside the system. And you could go to your regulator, you could go to your overseeing ministry and have some comfort that what that person was telling you was some reflection of policy. Now not uncommon at all to go to those people, be told something, and then have it turn out to be completely the opposite. And I certainly see this with my contacts in the system, some of which I've known for 25, 30 years, some of whom are now quite senior in the system, where we've had discussions where they've just been completely wrong on things that are in their own portfolio. And nothing's more exasperating from a sort of Chinese cultural point of view than losing face in that manner. And it's as simple as, in some cases, well, yes, the decision was in this direction, and then I received a phone call from Liu He, or I received a phone call from Fang Xinghai, and the decision was changed. Or I didn't receive a phone call and found out it was changed. That happens a lot as well. So a sort of effort to, if you will, short circuit the system, because the system is not responsive. Xi Jinping feels, I think, that the error of the Xi Jinping era was hyper-consultation, lots and lots of discussion, and no action. And so Xi Jinping, if nothing else, considers himself a man of action. I think the second thing is, though, that despite all that change and tweaking and effort to kind of make the system do what he wants, he's a traditional Chinese leader, you know, as the sort of princeling of princelings and somebody who that system is in his blood. He understands very fundamentally that he cannot really control the system without controlling the personnel, the Politburo especially. And he understands that when he wakes up in the morning, he is facing a Politburo standing committee, and on the military side, a Central Military Commission that he really had no hand in shaping. And so he understands that his goal, if he's really going to carry out these ambitious reforms that he's laid out for himself, must be to gain control of those key levers of power inside the system and run the personnel table. The other piece, I think, is that he's offending a lot of people and powerful institutions, especially with the anti-corruption campaign. Whether that is Jiang Zemin, the former retired leader who still wields obviously a lot of authority and power in the system, who, let's face it, has seen a large part of his political network in the military and in the party bureaucracy be eviscerated by the anti-corruption campaign, and yet still seems to weigh in on a fairly regular basis, to these sort of powerful interest groups, whether it's the state-owned enterprises, in some cases provincial leaders, and others. He's done a lot of damage in that regard. And what's striking is that you get the sense when you talk to people who are close to President Xi that despite being a princeling and being well connected within the system and so on, he's very, very dependent on sort of the forcefulness of his personality and on the public support that he's had for what he's doing as a sort of decisive Chinese leader. And interesting in that context, how has his public support been affected by the volatility in the markets and this sort of emerging notion of, is anybody at the steering wheel with regard to their economic management policy? So that's all very important. And as another indicator of this, I think we're now seeing this, as I mentioned earlier, spilling over into the press in the way that it hasn't happened in a while. It's interesting, you know, I think during the Hu Jintao era, those of us who do this for a living could afford to be a bit lazier. You know, we didn't have to read People's Daily every day, trying to see what new commentaries are out, you know, and so on. Again, Xi Jinping is a traditional leader. We see him using those old tools of, you know, fighting battles in the media. So these several series of editorials, which have been really well covered by the South China Morning Post in particular, this new character, Guo Ping, whoever he is, and these comments about, hey, party elders, get out of the day-to-day decision-making. I mean, that's a very strong statement, certainly directed at Jiang Zemin and others. A second one indicating that resistance to reform is unbelievably fierce, something along those lines, unimaginably fierce. This is not what they generally do, right? They want everyone to perceive that the leadership is in lockstep on everything and no public indication that they might be squabbling. So with those kind of very public indications of discord, you have the sense that the heat, if you will, behind the scenes is pretty heavy. And I think we see this manifest as well in the fact that we have yet to see President Xi comment at all on the economic distortions in the economy. Li Keqiang is the only one who's come out and said anything at this stage, and his statements have been underwhelming. So that tells me pretty strongly that we've got problems in this area, and it's something we're going to have to watch play out. I think the sort of plenum that will be coming next month will tell us a lot about all of this. My sense is that the leadership did do their annual pilgrimage to the seaside resort of Beidaihe. My sense is that the discussions there were quite contentious. Xi Jinping has, from my optic, an ambitious personnel agenda for the plenum next month, and it'll be a key indicator to us, I think, of what I mentioned earlier, his desire to try to seize control of the personnel for the 19th Party Congress, and what effect has these economic distortions had on his quest to do so. So that's sort of the political picture, and I think we can expect this will continue to unfold probably throughout Xi Jinping's tenure, or at least as they try to implement those very difficult reforms that we all saw and were very helpful about during the third plenum. I think a second and closely related new normal is a new normal of mixed messaging on economic policy and management. And this is sort of very difficult for folks who are in the markets like you are, trying to understand where the Chinese government may be going. And what's the key sort of function of this mixed messaging? I think it's developing awareness that they really are at a fundamental inflection point in their economic trajectory. I think it's fair that you can say, you've been able to say that probably since the third plenum, or since the new leadership came into power, that they were facing something of a tipping point or inflection point. But what's been quite striking to me in my conversations with senior Chinese officials and contacts is that if you talk to folks in the sort of 2012 period when the leadership first came in, and you ask them, well, okay, we all know that you need to rebalance the economy, but how long do you think the current economic model can go on for before it runs out of gas? And at that time, I was getting answers of 15 to 20 years, no problem. You know, we'll get there. We've got a lot of time. And then by the time of the third plenum, that was sort of down to 10 years. And by the time of sort of mid-2014, when the crunch of the slowdown that we're currently seeing really started to manifest itself, 5 to 7 years. And when I talked to people more recently, 2 to 3 years. So you really get this sense that, you know, they're really feeling the heat with regard to the need to make this change. And this is pretty simple. I think they face a stark choice. They're either going to dive in on reform and double down on it, or they're going to go into a defensive crouch and sort of stick with the current system as it is and hope to ride the tide. Or they're going to have some kind of messy, middling policy. So I suppose there's a third way as well. And with reform, you know, they've talked a lot about crossing the river by feeling the stones and, you know, slowly, 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 right? But I think there's a sense emerging now with the market difficulties and the currency devaluation difficulties that you either dive into the river or you're going to drown in the coming tide. So there's a real strong sense, especially among Xi Jinping's more reform-oriented advisors, that this is what they need to do. And like with the politics, I think we're seeing sort of several manifestations of this confusion on economic policy. The first is comments that have been made by leaders who are as senior as Li Keqiang, the premier, where he says 2 months ago, no devaluation. They do a devaluation. He says again in the last few days, no devaluation twice, right, within about 4 days. And given the past track record, I can't help but wonder, is he saying that because this is the policy decision they've made and he's just reinforcing the fact there won't be a devaluation? Or is that a point of view from him that he's trying to defend internally, and there's actually a real debate? I mean, I hear from folks I speak to, I don't know how authoritative these views are, but some thinking that what they actually need to do is a further substantial devaluation, maybe to the tone of 7 RMB to the US dollar, knowing full well that they would take a lot of international criticism for doing so, but judging that the domestic pain that they're currently feeling by not doing so and having to defend the currency at the tone of 10 to 15 billion US dollars per day, that's a high burn rate, even though you've got a lot of reserves in the tank. So some real discussions about this. We've had no word on SOE reform. They've talked and talked and talked and promised and told us that a plan is coming, and yet it has yet to manifest itself. My understanding is that the State Council has actually already approved 3 documents on state-owned enterprise reform. They're pending release. They were supposed to be released about 2 weeks ago, and they have not been released yet. And what's striking about these documents is that compared to the vision, if you will, that we saw in the third plenum documents, this is sort of half a loaf with regard to where they might be. Minority stake ownership as opposed to more room for private sector investment. Not much in the way of market access and opening that we might have seen. And yet they still can't get this stuff out. And so what that tells me is that the passive resistance, for lack of a better term, from I think it's the most abused term in the world, vested interests, but it is a good short-term handle. Whether it's state-owned enterprise leadership, their allies in the state bureaucracy, provincial level leaders who don't like the unfunded mandates that are coming down from Beijing, or who see their revenue streams drying up, and they're not confident that when Lou Jiwei tells them, don't worry, a fiscal rebalancing is coming your way next year, they're not confident that that's going to happen and that those resources are going to be directed in their way. So I think we see a lot of this, and not a strong sense of the forward trajectory on the reforms. And I think this is so critical because, people talk about the stock market intervention, people talk about the devaluation. Looked at in isolation, if you look at those 2 moves separately, I think it's a lot harder to justify the stock market intervention because they really overdid it. But certainly the currency devaluation, I mean, one way to look at it is kind of a masterstroke by Governor Zhou Xiaoquan by being able to sell it to the leadership internally as a devaluation and then sell it to the IMF as a market-oriented mechanism. So, that may be a smart move. But the problem is that these developments, and then you throw in the Tianjin gas explosion as well, they're being conflated in a way that they shouldn't probably, but this is what's happening, into an image that challenges, I would argue, their well-deserved 3-decade track record of managing the economy with something approaching infallibility. That's a bit of an overstatement, but certainly they have that reputation. And that's the big risk for the leadership. In isolation, these decisions, while ham-handed and problematic, are manageable. It's this bigger picture that there's a questioning of their competence to manage the economy that is really putting the markets into the turmoil that we're seeing. And the problem then is that when the leadership or the institutions come out and say, look, these moves that we're making are designed to act as a competent economic manager, a responsible economic manager to help the global economy stay stable and so on. I think what the market players see instead are some Hail Mary passes by a desperate government overseeing an economy that is in much worse shape than they wish to acknowledge. That's the perception. I don't think that's the reality, but that's the growing perception. And so what's the antidote to that? The antidote is they need to do something bold that shows the market players very clearly, hey, remember that pathway that we laid out at the third plenum? We're still on that. We're still on that course. And I've talked to many folks who are intimately involved in this process and sort of suggested to them, hey, you guys can pick the periodicity of how you do this. I would say maybe it's quarterly or something like that. But very regularly you have to put out something that is so unambiguously reform in orientation that no one will question that you're still on that pathway, because I think that's very important for them right now, and it's not happening. And then just finally on this sort of sense of the mixed messaging, you get the impression that Xi Jinping himself is perhaps turning left a little bit, turning more toward a statist style of thinking. It's clear to me, picking up on the first point, that there's some daylight between himself and Li Keqiang about how to handle a lot of these things. I get the sense that some of the people close to Xi Jinping feel a little betrayed, that maybe he has left where he was at the third plenum and has now sort of decided that, well, actually all state-owned enterprises deserve to be sort of advantaged and protected, and not just some. And we don't see him out there as regularly drawing the distinction that we saw in the third plenum between the so-called strategic sectors of the economy, where we can expect monopolies to basically continue, and the more so-called competitive sectors of the economy, where we were supposed to see a lot of room for private sector investment, both Chinese domestic and foreign, and we're just not seeing that. So this mixed messaging, I think, is going to be something we're going to see for quite a while, and it's going to make things messy, and there's going to be U-turns and so on, and we're just going to have to be prepared for that and hold on to our seats a little bit. And then finally, I'd say the third one is a new normal of sort of distance or competition in the U.S.-China relationship. Obviously, we have President Xi Jinping coming for an important state visit here in a couple of weeks. It seems that the laundry list of complications in the relationship grows longer every day, whether that's the South China Sea or whether that's the cyber issue. Human rights, which really has not been much of an issue focus during the Obama administration, I think will play pretty prominently in the summit, but not in a traditional sense, not with regard to dissidents and so on, but rather to what they might call human rights issues that affect you guys, the NGO law, the national security law. These sort of measures affect such a wide swath of interests, and therefore there's a lot of pressure coming on the U.S. government to deal with this. Obviously, domestically in the United States, there's very little incentive at this point for President Obama to sort of do Xi Jinping any favors on this upcoming visit. He's under heavy pressure. We can see the presidential silly season in the U.S. coming into play here. And a lot of the candidates are talking about China. Something that's been very striking to me is that China, since the spring, I would argue, has gone from a nothing issue in the 2016 contest to something of an issue. It's not going to be the foreign policy issue. That's going to be ISIS or Russia or things like that. But it's something of an issue, and of course China would prefer not to be an issue at all. And so that's what's so interesting about the summit preparations as we see going forward. My own feeling is that it really is up to the Chinese side to try to change the narrative with regard to Sino-US relations right now. And given the world I've just described, there's only one person in the system who can do that. That's Xi Jinping. And it's pretty clear to me that the foreign ministry and others at this stage have no instructions from the boss as to how they're supposed to handle this upcoming visit. And Susan Rice's visit was, I think, successful. There was a lot of good dialogue and discussion. I found it interesting that they, at least publicly, really emphasized the positive when supposedly all of this laundry list of difficulties is going to be put out there very clearly for President Xi. So I worry a little bit that the Chinese may get the wrong signal and then come into the meetings and get hammered and have to sort of respond defensively. And so there is this question of, is Xi Jinping willing to change the narrative? And something I find very striking is that there's a strong sense on the Chinese side there's really no interest for them in investing in the Obama administration at this stage. They feel that the change is coming. He's politically weak at home. It's difficult for them to feel that they should do so, but what myself and some others have encouraged Chinese friends to think about is, okay, don't necessarily invest in the administration. I disagree with that. I think they should invest in the administration, and I think the current administration still has a lot they can do with the Chinese. But if you want to accept that as a premise, invest in the relationship, in the U.S.-China relationship with the visit for two reasons. One, you can hopefully smooth the glide path toward whatever comes next. And I think the Chinese do assess accurately that whether it's Secretary Clinton or whether it's one of the 18 million Republican candidates that are currently in the contest, that whatever comes next will probably be a little bit tougher. There's a strong legacy when a new administration comes in of some bumps, some turbulence in the U.S.-China relationship. So investing in the relationship in a way that helps smooth that glide path would be valuable, I think. Secondarily, and perhaps more importantly, is investing in the relationship for the purpose of doing some, I think, badly needed reputational rehabilitation work with the American public. I don't know if folks have seen the latest Pew Research poll stuff on China, but China's favorability rating has gone off the cliff in those Pew Research polls, and it has always been very, very high. So it's quite striking, the data shift there. And I think this is for a couple of reasons. If you ask the average American, or if you tell the average American, well, China manipulates its currency, right? This was an issue for a long time. The average American would say, well, that sounds bad, but I don't really know what that means, right? Whereas if there are pictures on the front pages of the Washington Post and the New York Times of a giant blue ocean field on the left and a massive island on the right, this is sort of visceral, right? People take this in. The hack of the Office of Personnel Management, another sort of very clear issue. I always use as my barometer of average American sentiment on China my West Coast-based family. They're outside of the Beltway, and so I consider them more rational. And when that OPM hack occurred, I got emails from even my third and fourth tier relatives saying, so is all your information in a Chinese computer now? Because I used to work for the government, right? And so on. And I had to tell them, well, it's more complicated than that, and so on. But this is an issue. This is an issue. And I think Xi Jinping has a real opportunity with the visit to try to correct for some of this. And I would argue, in many ways, he's uniquely capable of doing so. I mean, this is a man who is, I think, a very talented retail politician. Hu Jintao was very stiff and wooden, and so on, and didn't like to do that kind of stuff. Xi Jinping is different in that regard. I think he showed some of that when he was in the United States last time, when he was vice president, going to Muscatine, Iowa, where he was there as an exchange student way back when, interacting with that family. The PR masterstroke, in my opinion, and so I'm hoping that the Chinese will see this opportunity again. And then just more broadly on the U.S.-China relationship, the thing that worries me, the security tensions are there. They're difficult. We need to deal with them. I would argue cyber is especially dangerous. But to some degree, these security tensions are intractable, right? This is what happens when a rising power meets an established power on the world stage. There's going to be some rub. The piece that worries me a little bit more is the emerging tensions in the economic relationship, because this has always been as Xi Jinping put it, the ballast and the propeller of the relationship. This is what keeps us from tipping over into a Cold War style competition between the United States and China. And that interdependence of our two economies is such a powerful force, such a powerful piece of glue that holds us together. And I think it's coming under strain, whether that is through the difficulties we're facing about growing U.S. concern with regard to the currency issue being back on the front pages, whether that is the industrial policy that has emerged under Xi Jinping that many of you in your businesses see every day, anti-monopoly investigations, pricing investigations, all of this sort of activity, favoring of national cum global champions. These are very difficult issues that we see. But I also think there's a tremendous amount of promise, and it's the most promising area in the relationship. So things like the bilateral investment treaty, I'm very hopeful about them. I think we're not going to get very far on the BIT in the Obama administration. It's an incredibly complex negotiation if it's done well. But we can get on the pathway. And we have an opportunity here before the summit to exchange negative lists again. And hopefully that will move us a little bit closer. One of the concerns, I think, is that, as with any second-term administration, officials start to run out of energy. They start to run out of bandwidth because they've been at it for 7, 8 years. It's a long slog. And whatever bandwidth the economic officials in the administration may have left, there's a sense that that'll largely be devoted to getting TPP across the line and or to a lesser degree perhaps, if the Iran deal is approved, which I think most people think it will be, unwinding the economic sanctions on Iran, where many of our friends and colleagues are already ahead of us in terms of getting into to business in Iran. So I hope that what we'll see coming out of the summit discussion is, if we can't make any progress on these security issues, and I think it will be very difficult, what we can do is go to that traditional strength of the economic relationship. And I think something where China could make a valuable contribution there is recognizing that their historical ally in the relationship, the U.S. business community, instead of being sort of a single voice of supporting stable and strong U.S.-China relations, has become sort of bifurcated, trifurcated, however you want to talk about it. And it's been balkanized to some degree into sort of haves and have-nots within the Chinese economy. Haves being companies that, for lack of a better term, they produce whiz-bang things that the Chinese can't do themselves. Those people are doing fine. The people who are in the sort of have-not category are people who either already have a Chinese near competitor or are operating in a sector where the Chinese government, for its own reasons, has decided that it wants to grow its own national champions, ITC probably the most obvious example, but there are others. And then I think there's sort of a third category of companies who quite intelligently have found a way to plug what they do into the activities of Chinese national champions. There are a couple of companies, Broadnet comes to mind with regard to what it does with its chips with ZTE and also with Huawei, all the big Chinese telecom players. Cummins, the engine company, is another firm that is sort of plugged very nicely into this. So you have these sort of 2 and 3 different camps, and so they're not coming to the administration with the same voice that they used to. And I think China has a unique opportunity to see that pattern emerging and take steps to bring that community back together. So that's a lot to throw at you. And let me just end by saying, this is a difficult patch, both domestically and in the foreign relationships. But I do not believe in the Thucydides trap and some of these other things that we've been seeing, or that the United States needs to fundamentally reorient its policy toward China and adopt a neo-containment strategy. That would be foolish on our part, and it would be foolish on China's part to sort of prompt us to do so. The way to do this is to deepen our engagement and not do things like cancel the summit, as has been recommended by some of our contestants in the presidential election, but rather to deepen the engagement, but to tell the Chinese very clearly, look, there are competitive elements of our relationship. I mean, one of the things I think that's been a problem in the last several years is that when our leaders meet, all we ever do is talk about all the cooperation, when in fact there's a lot of competition. And if you just recognize that and focus your energies on dealing with it, I think we'll have a healthier dialogue between the two sides. Thank you.
All right, we have time for some questions. So we'll start. Give me a microphone, please. Yes, over here.
Hi, fantastic speech, Christopher. Thank you very much.
Oh, please identify yourself and company and then ask your brief, to-the-point question.
Robin Meredith with Goldman Sachs. 2 quick questions. First, could you describe in a little bit more detail the chatter that you alluded to that you're hearing on infighting? Jiang Zemin faction being one, but any further details would be great. And secondly, speaking of new normal, can you talk about the South China Sea? Because China has this rather audacious island-building program, as you pointed out, and it seems a little bit difficult to reverse that for a lot of nations, not just the U.S.
Great. Thank you, Robin. Great questions. On the infighting, it's difficult. They don't telegraph this stuff too clearly, so you sort of have to read between the lines. But as I mentioned, and maybe I've just been doing this too long, but I am really struck by this return to a traditional play in the media, right? So, and again, sadly, this means you have to read your way through Renmin Ruban every day, because a lot of this stuff is sort of buried. But just in the last 2 weeks, to give a couple examples, you have these Guoping articles, one condemning the elders playing around in the politics, 2, the resistance to reforms. You had an interesting article that appeared out of nowhere using the Chinese Chengyu about when you go away, the tea gets cold. You know, this is something that was what was talked about, and you know, as sort of an allegory for you know, look, when you guys leave office, you need to stay away. Interestingly, a colleague of mine from the consulate was pointing out to me yesterday that, you know, People's Daily Online has been running this sort of series of commentaries about China's rise, and it all seems rather sort of pablum and so on. But out of nowhere, it appears in People's Daily, the one talking about how the Chinese leadership handled the stuff during the Asian financial crisis, and what a good job Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji did of, you know, sort of picking out how to respond and how accurately and properly they responded. I mean, this is code for attacking, you know, the people who are running the show now. And so I think we see signs of this, and it's obvious, you know, I mean, Jiang Zemin is almost 90, I think, at this stage, and yet about a year or so ago he decided that on one of the most humid days it was a good idea to go climb a mountain in Hainan. You know, this was probably very difficult for him to do, but he's doing it to show his political strength, right? And I think we continue to see signs that you know, all is not well. And this comes in the form of whisper campaigns against Li Keqiang, notions that at the next party Congress, they will decide to shrink the Politburo Standing Committee even further from its current 7 down to 5, presumably so that they don't have to telegraph who the successor is going to be. That's a big change if they don't do that. The notion that Wang Qishan will defy these recent age norms and stay in power in some way. I think there's a lot of this, there's a cacophony of this sort of stuff out there. South China Sea, real quickly, you know, this is a very difficult policy dilemma for the U.S. because at the end of the day, the notion you get is that the Chinese just care about this more than we do. I mean, you know, to put it very, very bluntly. And are we going to go to war with a thermonuclear power over some rocks? You know, probably not likely. You see a lot of policy debate in the United States on this. I think it's very clear from what we've seen that the Pentagon, most particularly the Pacific Command, is very keen to respond. And the reason why is maybe not necessarily the claims, but rather it's a slippery slope. If you start to give ground, then the PLA may decide that they want to push the envelope on areas that really do matter to you. So it's very challenging and difficult. If they're fully determined, which I think they are, how do we respond? And the key, in my opinion, is if the U.S. is going to make statements about what they're going to do, you better back it up, and you better have notions 2 and 3, steps 2 and 3 firmly in mind, because the Chinese side will.
Another question. Tom.
Thank you, Chris. Tom Gorman, Fortune China. Chris, you mentioned the importance in the U.S.-China context of the upcoming Xi Jinping visit to Washington. I just learned this morning that his visit dates are going to overlap with the papal visit.
Yeah.
How do you see the public relations aspect of that playing out?
You know, I got to think that the people planning the summit in Beijing just, you know, they're starting to say to themselves, why did we pick these particular dates? I mean, you know, the Pope will leave literally, I think, as Xi Jinping is landing. And yeah, there will be a strong contrast between, you know, the Holy Father, the guy that everybody loves to love, right? And Xi Jinping, the face of, you know, this sort of, as some would say, more assertive China. So yeah, from a PR perspective, it's a challenge. And obviously the meeting between the President and the Pope will be very positive and, you know, glad-handing and so on. So yeah, it does create some challenges. But I don't think they're insurmountable challenges. And a lot of it has to do with the tone that Xi Jinping sets when he hits Seattle, right, before that happens, and you know, how and if he's able to steal some of the headlines, you know, from the papal visit, which maybe he'll be able to do if he plans it properly.
Yes, George.
George Yun, Board Director of Vision Corporation. Mr. Johnson, how you read into the September 3rd military parade in terms of domestic policy and foreign relations?
Thank you. Yeah, I realized I planned this when Richard kindly extended me the invitation to come out and do this. I immediately made plans to tack on a trip to Beijing because at the request of my better half, I was off the road for most of the summer. And so it's time to go back and replug in and figure out what's going on. This was well before they announced the dates of the military parade. So this is completely screwing up my visit to China because no one wants to come out and meet on the days of the parade. But you know, my sense is that initially, I think, as they were conceiving the parade and the propaganda, the sort of media coverage and central media coverage very much had this tone when they were first putting this out. This was going to be the anti-Japan show. I mean, you know, really strong and forward-leaning. I think they've dialed that back quite a bit, although we'll see what speech President Xi makes. Obviously, one of the challenges is that Tom just made an allusion to the PR aspect. You know, what do U.S. media organizations do when talking heads like me are being interviewed? You know, in the background, they show file footage. And the file footage will be of Xi Jinping rolling down Chang'an Avenue in an open-top Jeep wearing a Mao tunic with bristling missiles around him. You know, this is not the image probably that China might want to have seen. It does give him an opportunity to showcase his authority, you know, no doubt about it, and to sort of put out there the vision that he is the face of rising China, you know, and for that it probably will deliver him some political benefits. I don't know if folks have seen, but there's a fascinating article in Bloomberg this morning that says that basically the parade will be used as a stepping stone for Xi Jinping to announce a massive reconfiguration of the Chinese military's command structure, consistent with the reform plans from the Third Plenum. My first account at the Central Intelligence Agency was civil-military relations in China, and I can tell you they've been talking about this reform since 1985. And so if he's able to do it, much like the National Security Council, this will be a huge coup. So, you know, there's a lot of reasons where he'll benefit. I would say the other one is he scored a sort of propaganda coup by having Park Geun-hye, the president of South Korea, agree to come. This has certainly not been a popular decision in Washington. I'm not sure she's fully thought that one through with regard to appearing on the rostrum between President Xi and President Putin. I don't know if that's the image she wants to have out there as the leader of a democratic South Korea. But you know, there'll be a lot of opportunities with the parade. That said, there's a lot of cynicism. You know, you talk to Chinese about it, they complain. They say, you know, look at the markets, or the sky is falling and we're spending all this money on a military parade. You know, there's an implicit sort of sense of some tone deafness on the part of the leadership doing this while they're having these economic difficulties.
A question over on this side. Don't want to ignore anybody here. Yes.
Michael Kleibanner from BlackRock. To your point about mixed messages, I wonder with respect to the economic management if, on the one hand, it's because we're at this inflection point, it's difficult, right? The strategy is hard. Yeah. Another interpretation that seems to be coming out is maybe the economy just isn't Xi Jinping's priority. His priority is returning China to its, quote, rightful place in the world, and it's political and geopolitical, and the economy is just a means to an end rather than an end to itself. And if that were the case, if the economy is not really the thing he cares about, if this kind of volatility and this poor messaging and communication is something we need to get used to, and that, in fact, is the new normal. What's your sort of your opinion on, you know, where their sentiments lie?
Yeah, thank you, Michael. That's a very insightful and incisive comment. And I think I'm sorry, I meant to bring my prop with me, but I forgot it this morning. If you looked at yesterday's Wall Street Journal, the Asia edition, two very stark juxtaposition commentaries on how to think about this very problem. Andy Brown's article, where he was sort of saying that, exactly to your point, hey, everyone, Xi Jinping doesn't really care about that. He cares about, you know, the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation and saving the party from itself. And the anti-corruption campaign is critical in that. And therefore, even if it does shave, pick your number, percentage points off GDP, it's worth doing because long term, it's going to get them where they want to be. And then you have an article written by Orville Schell, much longer, that sort of says, you know, this is a manifestation of the bloom coming off the Xi Jinping rose. And here's an opportunity for him to be able to dial it back, have some humble pie, and maybe have a little bit more, sort of more cooperative approach going forward. I mean, my own sense is very much as you lay out. I don't think this is a top priority for him. It is a means to an end to some degree. You know, you do get the flavor sometimes that there is an effort similar to what we saw in many Southeast Asian countries in the late 90s. You know, pick a couple of economists who are Western trained and the darlings of the IMF and others, put them out in front, you know, to sort of do the messaging, while behind the scenes it's the same game. And I think there is a concern among his sort of more reform-oriented advisors that they are, for lack of a better term, they're losing him, you know, to the politics, right? And when they need him to champion the reforms. So my own sense is that that is sort of his inclination. What we would hope is that a figure like Li Keqiang then comes in and fills the space, right, and is the guy who's managing this piece. But he doesn't seem to have the authority necessarily day to day to be able to do that. So that's my sense.
Well, would you please join me in thanking Chris for a terrific opening to our conference?
Thanks, Richard. Thanks again.